Greetings everyone and welcome to Spacing Out. I'm Jason McClellan. Once again, Maureen is MIA this week. She's out working on another project, so it's just me this week. But I'll be joined by Robbie Graham later in the show, and we'll talk about UFO-related films. Robbie studies that, and he's the guy to talk to about it. So we'll do that later in the show. But first, let me get you caught up on some of the news stories that have made headlines recently. Last week, we told you that scientists at a recent conference titled The Present-Day Habitability of Mars at the University of California, Los Angeles discussed a potential energy source found on Mars, perchlorate, a chlorine-containing chemical detected on Mars by NASA's Phoenix lander in 2008. Well, based on recent discoveries by NASA's Mars rover Curiosity, it looks like perchlorate could be widespread across Mars. Doug Archer, a scientist at NASA's Johnson Space Center, presented the possibility of widespread perchlorates on Mars on March 18th at the 44th Annual Lunar and Planetary Science Conference in the Woodlands, Texas. Archer pointed out that in addition to Curiosity and Phoenix, previous robots such as the Viking landers, Sojourner, Spirit, and Opportunity detected chlorine at various locations on Mars. Space.com points out that Archer carefully clarified, "I'm not saying that all of the chlorine everywhere on Mars is in the form of perchlorates. There are likely other chlorate salts as well." He went on to explain, "I believe that at least some of the chlorine at all of these locations is present as perchlorate." According to Space.com, Archer believes the implications of globally distributed perchlorates are very important for climate, habitability, and present-day aqueous processes. In other news, mysterious rings on the floor of the Namib Desert in southern Africa have baffled scientists for years. But based on new research, scientists at the University of Hamburg think they have identified what creates this strange phenomenon. Life Science explains that these fairy circles, as they're known, appear in regular patterns and they can last for decades. Although these bizarre circles are a bit crop circle-ish, biologist Norbert Jurgens at the University of Hamburg thinks that termites, rather than aliens, create the circles. While studying the fairy circles, Dr. Jurgens found the circles contained sand termites. Nature World News further explains that Dr. Jurgens determined the circles contain other telltale signs of the insects, including forage plant material and underground tunnels, signaling that they were not just visiting when Jurgens saw them. Dr. Jurgens' study was published in the journal Science. Chemist Yvette Nadi of the University of Pretoria, South Africa, didn't participate in Dr. Jurgens' study, but she told Life Science that the study is a useful addition to debating the origin of the fairy circles. But she goes on to state that the study does not address the key question as to what is the primary factor that caused sudden plant mortality, i.e. the birth of fairy circles. Life Science suggests it is possible the termites don't cause the fairy circles, but merely live in them. So, although this new study supports the theory that fairy circles are caused by termites, questions remain and a conclusive explanation has yet to be made. A new UFO extraterrestrial theme exhibit opened in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The grand opening of Encounters UFO Experience took place on April 4th at the Myrtle Beach exhibit space Broadway at the Beach. According to Myrtle Beach Online, this exhibit is the result of more than 5 years of research and 3 years of assembling content and artifacts. The exhibit's website describes, Encounters UFO Experience is an out-of-this-world, family-friendly exhibit based on the widespread interest in alien life. Within its 7 galleries, it incorporates over 200 original and reproduction artifacts, documented film and recordings, conceptual models, and interactive experiences. Replicas throughout the exhibition are based on reports of alien encounters. This extraordinary extraterrestrial experience is the first of its kind and is making its world debut in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Myrtle Beach Online explains that Broadway at the Beach was selected as the venue for the Encounters exhibit because the success of the location's previous exhibit, which was Bodies Revealed, in addition to the area's substantial tourism traffic. Myrtle Beach is also appealing to the exhibit's developers due to the large number of UFO sightings in the area. The exhibit will host occasional UFO-related lectures. The first lecture, presented by nuclear physicist and UFO researcher Stanton Friedman, took place on April 4th at the nearby Legends in Concert. Encounters UFO Experience is scheduled to run through September 2nd. And speaking of Stanton Friedman, he was recently a guest on Podcast UFO, a weekly show hosted by Martin Willis exploring the UFO phenomenon. During the interview, Friedman candidly stated, "I just want to make sure everybody realizes there really aren't any unidentified flying objects. It's a great story, it's exciting, but it's fiction." Podcast UFO published this on April 1st, and yes, it was a lighthearted April Fool's joke. Chris Hadfield, Canadian astronaut and the commander of Expedition 35 on the International Space Station, also thought it would be entertaining to have some April Fool's Day fun. He tweeted a few pictures of what he called a huge piece of debris. Well, this debris was a disc-shaped UFO Hadfield claimed was approaching the station. Then he tweeted a photo of him holding an alien in his hands. You never know what news stories will come out on April Fool's Day. Well, and finally, something that continues making headlines is the story published by the FBI stating that a UFO file is their most popular file in their online public reading room, The Vault. Here to tell us more about this story is Alejandro Rojas. Alejandro?
All right, thanks, Jason. The FBI made some news last week, and I think this story is interesting for a couple of reasons. The FBI decided to release a story where essentially they said that a UFO file has been the most popular file in their FBI vault. The Vault is a website that they launched a couple years ago to house their most popular files and topics, things like Al Capone. But it turns out people are most interested in UFOs. The second part of this story, though, is about how the media has got it all wrong about this memo. Items such as the memo coming out a couple years ago when the Vault was released, that's not the case. The FBI makes it clear that this memo has been out since the 70s. And that it's been online for several years. Another point is that it is not related to Roswell. A lot of the media have called it the Roswell memo. Well, the FBI says this memo has nothing to do with Roswell. It came out years after Roswell, and essentially the contents of the memo are that of a rumor that had gotten back to the Washington office of the FBI, where they made a note that some Air Force officer had said something about some crashed UFOs with some beings, and so they made a note of this memo. But the memo, which is very short, makes a note that there was no investigation done on the matter. And that was the third point that the FBI wanted to point out, is that they did not investigate UFOs, and that in fact, even though they helped out the Air Force a little bit with their UFO investigations, soon after this memo, they stopped investigating UFOs at all. Another really interesting note is that UFO researchers have thought that this memo is probably part of a hoax. There's a book that came out by Frank Scully called Behind the Flying Saucers, and it was mostly based off of rumors that came from an oil man named Silas Newton, who turned out to be a con man, and all of these things turned out to be lies. And this memo was very similar to what he was saying, and during the same time. So a lot of UFO investigators think it's a hoax. The FBI actually addressed this in their story, and they said, we don't know if it is or is not part of a hoax, but it's interesting that they at least addressed that most common idea behind this memo in the UFO community. Also, we're going to be addressing the FBI files in our YouTube web series online called Your Need to Know with Antonio Huneeus. And he's going to go more in depth with the UFO files that are in the vault. So check that out. Back to you, Jason.
Thanks so much, Alejandro. Well, now it's time for our interview with Robbie Graham. Robbie Graham, in my opinion, is an expert when it comes to UFO-related movies. Movies that deal with extraterrestrial life, aliens, flying saucers. Robbie investigates this stuff, he researches it, follows it all the time. He's the guy to talk to, so let's talk to him now. Well, I am very excited to welcome Robbie Graham to the show. Robbie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's great to be here, Jason. It's finally, just been saying, we've been trying to organize this for a while, and great to finally speak to you and to be on the show. I'm a big fan. Well,
thank you. Yeah, you and I have talked back and forth for a while now, digitally, and yeah, I've definitely wanted to talk to you for a while. I know you were a film student, and UFO films are something that you definitely have a big interest in, and I've always wanted to ask you. I don't know how you actually got into this. What made you want to focus on UFO-related films?
Well, it stems from the fact that academically, my background is film, always been interested in cinema, one of my big passions in life, and also always been interested in UFOs, at least since my teens. Excuse me. And so it seemed natural that these two interests should merge. But when I looked at the UFO field, I realized that people were very interested in Hollywood's representations of the UFO subject. but it was strange that no one seemed to be focusing specifically on that angle. And so I thought, well, there's a gap to be filled there, and thought it'd be fun to fill it.
Well, you filled it well, in my opinion. And, the UFO fascination, Hollywood fascination with UFOs and extraterrestrials certainly isn't a new thing that's come up in recent years, but there does seem to be a higher concentration of those films and more coming out more quickly after another. And it seems more to be the case with blockbusters, Hollywood big budget films that typically come out during the summer that are their big money makers. That seems to be a favorite theme of theirs, and one in, I guess, recent history is a relative term, but Independence Day was a big one that a lot of people refer back to as a recent film that got a lot of attention. It was a major big money film focused on UFOs and extraterrestrials. And we just heard that there's going to be 2 sequels, right, to Independence Day?
That's right. The 20th Century Fox has just announced a 2-part sequel to Independence Day, ID Forever Part 1 and ID Forever Part 2. So, Roland Emmerich, the director, has announced them. I think it's yet to be officially confirmed by Fox, but it's pretty much confirmed. They won't be starring Will Smith. They'll be starring Bill Pullman again in his role as the president. The character of Will Smith's stepson, who was in the original film as a very young boy, will now be older, obviously. It's set 25 years later, and he's going to be one of the main characters. It's passed over to a new generation, essentially. But it's going to be looking at the same aliens coming back through a wormhole, which for them would be a blink of an eye, but for us, 25 years have passed. And it's going to pick up right where it left off, essentially, for the aliens, but for us, a whole new generation will be fighting off these extraterrestrials. Humanity this time will have recaptured alien technology and has, to an extent, learned how to reverse engineer this and to use it, to fight back against the ETs. It could be interesting. The first movie obviously was hugely successful, $800 million at the box office. One of the most iconic UFO movies ever. And it's hard to think about the idea of alien visitation in a factual way without images from Independence Day, Close Encounters, and other UFO movies.
It doesn't surprise me. The extraterrestrial theme is everywhere in pop culture, so it doesn't surprise me that filmmakers like to go to this theme in their movies. But there have been some weird examples recently where this theme is sort of forced into films where it doesn't really seem like it would make sense. We just saw that in the last Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, Indiana Jones with aliens. And now we have the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles reboot that is now taking the Turtles and throwing an extraterrestrial element into that. I think that's fascinating.
It is, and I mean, that's Michael Bay for you. The fanboys are not pleased about what Michael Bay has done to the Turtles. And it could be interesting, though. To clarify there, Michael Bay has announced that the Ninja Turtles will now be extraterrestrial or interdimensional in origin. So that's going to be interesting. And I'm sure, as with Michael Bay's Transformers movies, you will see the incorporation of quite specific ufological detail into those films. I think that could be quite interesting. What you've got basically is Hollywood filmmakers now constantly referencing factual ufological literature and debate and incorporating very specialized ideas into fictional narratives. And what that does is it serves to both bring those ideas into the mainstream, but simultaneously, because they're presented in a fictional context, in a fantastical context, I think there's an argument to be made that it also fictionalizes those ideas as well. So it's pros and cons.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to talk about this later, but we'll go ahead and jump into it now, and that's the whole conspiracy angle with Hollywood. There's a lot of conspiracy talk about motives behind some of these Hollywood films that come out. And you brought to my attention, I hadn't heard about this film, but a film called The Umbra that's coming out. Tell us about The Umbra. This one deals with something that's big in conspiracy world.
Yeah, it was originally titled The Umbra, which was a spec script written in 2009 by a guy called Stephen Kosinski. And This is a film that really, if you read the script, and the script is available online, but it's now been rewritten several times, but it should still basically resemble what it was. It's a film that, if you know your UFO literature and your conspiracy theory, then you will see very direct references in there to the Phil Schneider story, who, he's the guy who came forward and spoke at various conferences during the 1990s, testifying to his alleged involvement in a firefight with extraterrestrials at the Dulce facility, the alleged Dulce facility in New Mexico. And this is really one of the cornerstones of conspiracy law today. The idea of the Dulce base and the Phil Schneider story. And what you've got is basically that entire story, or the key concepts from it, lifted and put into this screenplay, which is called Umbra. Umbra is a Latin word which means the darkest part of the shadow. And it also is a National Security Agency code word for an above top secret clearance. So if you read the script again, I don't want to give too much away, obviously, but it's the version that I read, and the version that you can read online is it deals with the idea of extraterrestrials collaborating with human elites in an underground facility, human experimentation, and it's very, very dark, very disturbing reading. And so that's going to be interesting should it finally come to the big screen. It's on its way. It's had 2 or 3 different directors attached to it now, multiple screenwriters. I think at the moment it's Joe Carnahan, who did the A-Team movie, and he's currently attached to it. And it's slated for release, I think, in 2014, but they keep pushing it back. So clearly they're having production troubles there. Whether or not that's because it's a sensitive subject, who knows?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting example to me of a film that's taking something that is alleged to be true and feeding it into a fictional movie. And even the name of one of the characters is interesting to me. They have a character named Lazar in there.
Right. Yeah, clearly named after Bob Lazar. One of the characters is Lazar. In terms of character names, the 2009 film, which is a children's film, Race to Witch Mountain, that was directed by a guy called Andy Fickman, and basically he was a guy who was born and raised in Roswell, New Mexico. He grew up with the law, LORE as opposed to the law. He was a UFO buff, and Disney chose him to direct this film because of his really intense fascination with UFOs and his knowledge of the subject. And he chose to name 2 of his characters in that film after ufologists. I interviewed him in 2010, and I said, 2 of your characters, that one of them's named Alex Friedman, and one of them's named Pope. And I said, was that after Stanton Friedman and Nick Pope? And he was like, yes. He says, no one picked up on that. But it's just these tiny little details. But that film is absolutely infused with ufological detail. There's a number of famous UFO researchers in the film itself as themselves, including Whitley Strieber and Rob Simone. So that was a film that really, really taps directly into this very niche UFO conspiracy field. And there are many like those.
Let's go from there and talk about just the sheer number of children movies or movies catering towards a younger audience dealing with UFOs and extraterrestrials, because there seems to be an incredible number of those that come out every single year. And, I think back to films I watched growing up, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and one of my favorites, Flight of the Navigator, and that's actually being remade. So interesting with these children's movies, but a lot of them are Disney movies, and there's a lot of talk and speculation about Disney and their role in this whole UFO thing, and what sort of possible disclosure motives could be behind that.
Is Disney the disclosure studio? I've always wanted to. I keep telling myself I have to write an article called Disney, Disclosure Studio. I wrote an article about UFOs and Disney, trying to chart the relationship, the interplay between Disney and the UFO phenomenon, going back to the 1950s. And there is a lot to talk about with regards to UFOs and Disney. Disney as a studio has always been, well, since the 1950s at least, been very interested in the idea of extraterrestrial visitation. Of course, this stems back to the Ward Kimball case of the mid-1950s, when you had the famous animator Ward Kimball, claim in the 1970s, he claimed in the 1970s that during the 1950s, the Air Force approached Disney himself and requested their collaboration on a documentary, an educational documentary that would help acclimate the public to the idea of ET life, ET visitation. And the Air Force, according to Kimball, promised Disney real footage of UFOs for inclusion in this documentary. Now, it all fell through, and the Air Force pulled the footage at the last minute, and it never went ahead. But Disney went on to make, in the same time period, a number of space-themed and alien-themed documentaries, educational documentaries in their Man in Space series. Beyond that, of course, you had, as I said, Escape to Witch Mountain in 1975, which was targeted at kids. One of the first proper children's UFO movies, I suppose. You had Flight of the Navigator, as you say, a Disney film, which is now being remade by Disney. You had Race to Witch Mountain, and you've had numerous products over the years come out from Disney. What's interesting about Disney's representations of UFOs and ET life is that whereas most studios tend to go down the invasive route with their depictions of ETs, Disney often presents a more balanced perspective. So although you'll have invasive ETs in some of their movies or frightening ETs, typically that will be counterbalanced by having cuddly, friendly ones. And now that just might be because, of course, it's a kids, they're kids' films, and there has to be something to latch onto in a friendly way. But whatever the reasoning behind it, Disney are actually one of the most balanced studios for depictions of extraterrestrial intent, shall we say. Whereas most, as I say, most just go down the Independence Day route because it sells. It's easy to do. It's easier to write, I think, a hostile extraterrestrial than it is a benevolent one, and it's easier for the drama.
Right. Well, with these children's movies, there are plenty of people who assert that this is a way to get children accustomed to the thought of extraterrestrial life and aliens coming to Earth. It's something that, I'd love to hear your thought on, is something that I see. It happens in the U.S., but I see it a lot in the U.K. A lot of schools with younger children, schools are more and more using aliens and UFOs as writing assignments, ways for their creative writing programs. They'll stage a UFO crash at the school and have the kids go out and do an investigation, and they'll use it as a writing exercise.
Are they doing that in the US as well?
There are some schools doing it in the US, but I mainly see it in the UK.
Yeah, this is really, really, really interesting. And it's something that, because I try to focus so much on Hollywood specifically and on entertainment, this kind of falls slightly out of my purview. And I was hoping that someone might pick it up and do a really thorough investigation of it. But I might end up doing it. But it really demands some attention, I think. This is very, very interesting. What you've seen really over the last year to 18 months, maybe even slightly longer, is a scheme sweeping across UK schools, primary schools, for young kids aged between, I guess, 5 and 11 years old, where you have kids coming in the morning for their usual day, and they're told by the teachers that there's been a spaceship crash, on the school grounds or just outside the school grounds. The police are there, and there will actually be police on site, and it'll all be cordoned off. There'll be a crash site cordoned off, and there'll be little alien clues placed around the school, like gloop and goo and kind of stuff like that, and little bits of wreckage, and it's up to the kids to kind of put together what's happened. And what you'll see is in the reporting, you'll see all of these stories reported in the local newspapers, but it never makes national news. So I've never seen a single national news story on it, but you pick it up in the local newspapers, and you can start to put together a picture of what's going on. And clearly there's clearly I'm trying to trace exactly who has come up with this idea, because it's not just random that people are all having the same idea to stage UFO crashes in the school. There must be an educational authority behind it. It could be completely innocent. It could just be that it makes a great day for the kids, and then it tests out certain logical faculties for them and things like that. It gets them interacting with the local community support officers and police and things like that. So of course it does that, but it is tempting from within our field to look at that and say, what's really going on here? And it is very interesting. And whether or not there's any conspiracy behind it, the result of that is arguably that kids from a very young age, in the UK at least, are being introduced to the idea that we are not alone in the universe, and being presented with crash retrieval scenarios. So it kind of filters into the subconscious from a very early age. And this is something that films do as well. This is something that Disney movies have done, and that many other studios have done through their kids' films. If you look at any popular UFO movie of the last 20 years, really, most of them are aimed at young kids, either very young kids, tweens, or teens. All you have to do is look at the age rating on a movie to see who its target audience is. And most of these audiences, including Independence Day, Men in Black, Race to Witch Mountain, even Battleship and things like that, they're usually aged between PG, PG-13, never above that, because the moment that makes sense from a financial perspective, because the moment you get an age restriction above PG-13, you're restricting your audience, and therefore you're essentially halving the box office potential of your movie. So typically studios nowadays want to kind of aim for the PG-13, the PG mark. But all of these movies, all of these UFO movies, are being targeted generally to young people. And I suppose you've got to ask, regardless of whether or not there's any, agenda behind that, you've got to ask what effect this is having on young people's perceptions of life in the universe, about place in the universe, and of what extraterrestrials might look like, how they might interact with us. And, it's fair to say that cinema, movies, TV, have a very significant impact on not only our perception of the world as adults, but especially young people's perceptions of the world around them. It's not the only defining factor in terms of influence, but it's a very significant one. And so that bears thinking about. So with that in mind, you've got to ask, well, what are the messages that Hollywood is putting out about ET life? And unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate that overwhelmingly we are being presented with a very negative image of potential extraterrestrial life. We're used to seeing hostile creatures on screen, monstrous creatures that bear very little resemblance to us, and who really want to enslave humanity, to conquer humanity, to strip the earth of its resources. Stephen Hawking, of course, is fully on board with that idea. Michio Kaku, not so much. It depends on your perspective, I guess. But I think it's fair to say I'm writing a chapter at the moment for the book that I'm writing, Silver Screen Sources, Sorting Fact from Fiction. The chapter I'm writing at the moment is entirely dedicated to invasion movies, and looking at how realistic Hollywood's alien invasions are compared to what scientists have estimated they might be. So I'm looking at Michio Kaku, I'm looking at Stephen Hawking, I'm looking at various of the sort of ideas that have been put forward by think tanks, for example, military think tanks, about the idea of ET invasion. What might we expect? How might we repel those invasions realistically with the technology that we have today? Could we? And I think really the answer is no. So even if we do face invasion, even if these ETs are hostile, as Hollywood likes to assume, then we needn't worry about putting up much of a fight. It's going to be over very quickly. We don't have the technology to fend off a civilization which naturally would be many thousands of years more advanced than we are. If they're getting here from there, they're using technology which is far beyond anything that we can conceive of, really, and therefore we would pose very little threat to them.
And it's interesting to see the sort of hostile idea carry over into the children's movies too. It's done in a very cute and playful way, but take a show like Mars Needs Moms, and
Disney again.
It's just another way of showing aliens coming here and taking our resources, in that case being moms, but it's painting it in a nice way, but it's still sending the same message.
Yeah, Disney is actually really interested in Mars. Going back to the 1950s, where they had Man on Mars, or Mars and Beyond, Ward Kimball's documentary Mars and Beyond, which was I think 1957. and they were looking at the idea of life on Mars as early as 1957. You also had Mission to Mars, which was Disney, which was 2000, I believe. That was a disastrous flop at the box office, but again, it was presenting the idea of ancient civilization on Mars that was discovered by NASA astronauts. It actually had cooperation from NASA, bizarrely, that film, despite presenting what NASA would publicly claim is an absolutely ludicrous idea. You had, as you say, Mars Needs Moms, which was one of the most expensive films ever, using its really brilliant motion capture technology. It's actually not a terrible film. It's one of the biggest flops ever. I think it may even be the biggest flop of all time, because it was so expensive to make, yet no one went to see it. Disney also did John Carter, of course, John Carter on Mars. Disney will not let the idea of Mars go. No one ever goes to see a Mars movie. No one is interested in Mars at the cinema. We flee from Mars movies. We're not interested. I think when it comes to the idea of alien life, we'd rather see something in a galaxy far, far away, or something come and invade us. We're not interested in Mars because we've been presented with an image of Mars by NASA for so long as an arid, lifeless planet that if they're asking us to think of it as being anything other than that, it really stretches the imagination to breaking point, I think. And I think that Mars bores us as cinema goers. I mean, clearly it does, because we just do not go and see Mars movies. They are all flops, apart from Total Recall, which was 1990. That's really the only successful Mars movie ever made. But Mars Needs Moms was disastrous, and Disney shouldn't, if they haven't learned their lesson by now, then you've got another Mars movie coming out next year called Last Days on Mars, which isn't Disney. But I'll be amazed if it actually reaches the cinema, to be honest, because the track record for Mars at the box office is, as I say, it's disastrous.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in terms of Mars being a terrible idea for films because of that. Because that's an interesting point. That's my theory anyway. It's hard to kind of rationalize why is it that people don't go and see Mars movies, because we don't. They are all flops. Total Recall, as I say, was the only really successful Mars movie, and that had a lot more going for it than just Mars. It was a good movie as well. But it was obviously based on a Philip K. Dick book and great plot, and it was just a great fun film. But as I said, but even some of the good Mars movies, there are some of the good Mars movies, but they're terrible. Mars Needs Moms is no worse than many of the the kids movies that come out. It's actually a lot better in many ways than some of them, but something about Mars just puts us off. But Disney, as I say, Disney won't let the idea go, so that's interesting. Disney have just teamed up with NASA again, in fact, to do an IMAX film looking at a fictional exosolar planet. Right, a habitable world. Yeah. Sure. Very cool.
So again, NASA and Disney cooperating closely there to look at the idea of alien life. So that relationship between Disney and various government branches does go way back.
Yeah, I find all this fascinating. I love seeing the various representations and various ideas about extraterrestrial life and UFOs, and just the way that everybody presents them differently, and also exploring the potential reasons or motives behind these filmmakers to put these films out. So this is great. You mentioned your book. When is your book going to come out?
That's the question. I've been writing it for absolutely ages. It's something that I'm really putting a great deal of time and effort into. It's going to be 8 chapters. It's all planned out. I've written a substantial amount of it. It's just a matter of organizing it in a way that's really accessible to both kind of the novice ufologist and the expert, and also people who have no interest in UFOs whatsoever, and also people who are completely new to science fiction. It's something that I'm hoping will have mass appeal, but that will really have something new for everyone as well. It will be finished this year, that's for sure. And I'm hoping that it will be published next year.
Well, since the first time I heard that you were writing it, I've been looking forward to it. I won't pressure you at all. Take your time. But that's going to be excellent. Well, Robbie, this has been fun. And, I think we barely grazed the surface of this interesting topic, and there's plenty more to talk about. And as we said, there are always UFO movies coming out, so we'll never run out of things to talk about. But thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been great.
Well, thanks, Jason. It's great to chat with you.
All right, take care, Robbie. If you'd like to follow Robbie's work, check out his website, silverscreensaucers.blogspot.com. He's very active on Twitter and Facebook, so you can go to his website and find out where you can follow him online. Well, that's all for this episode of Spacing Out, guys. Until next week's episode, OpenMinds.tv is where you can go for all the latest UFO news. OpenMinds.tv is also where you can listen to Open Minds UFO Radio or watch our other Open Minds produced video content. And in case you didn't know, Spacing Out is available in both video and audio formats, and you can access both at openminds.tv/spacing-out. If you're watching the video version of the show, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us your comments, and if you like the episode, click the like button. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Jason McClellan, and I'll see you in the future.